Well, hello. Thank you for joining me as we study the book of James. I thought before I dive into chapter 1, I would just talk about some of the background information for the book of James. The book of James is within a section of the New Testament near the end of the book called general letters. That's because we don't know specifically the churches in which they were written to. They were written not to one body of believers, but to a general audience, and that's why they're known as part of the general letters. James is the person writing. James is the half brother of Jesus. There's another book in the New Testament also written to us or included, written by another half brother of Jesus, and that would be the book of Jude, the shortest book in the New Testament. So James and Jude are full brothers, and I think it's interesting that we have two books in the New Testament written by siblings of Jesus Christ. The book of James has been called the Proverbs of the New Testament because there's lots of short sayings. It applies truth to life in various situations. So it's a great book to study. It's a great book to read. I hope you've been enjoying reading it. I hope you have read through chapter 1 because that's what we're going to discuss today. So before we get into that, the audience, the people that James was writing to. So James was a pastor in the main church in Jerusalem, and we're told in verse 1 that he's writing this to the 12 tribes that are scattered throughout outside of Jerusalem. They're scattered because of persecution, and so as they scattered to the different locations they went to, they left because of persecution, and they experienced oppression. And one of the things that it mentions is that they're being taken advantage of by wealthy landlords. The people that own the lands they're working on are taking advantage of them. We're also told in this book that they're taken advantage by the rich, which would make them poor or less than rich. They're taken advantage by the rich people. They're taken to court by wealthy people. And in response to that, James tells the audience to wait patiently for the Lord. So we see that there's a problem of the church acting very worldly, acting not as they should, and that's one of the reasons James addresses some of these things. Now, James is seen as a series of sermons from a pastor to a scattered church. So they're no longer in their hometown. They're no longer where they used to be. They're scattered throughout. And their pastor, Pastor James, is sending them a series of sermons. And so that's the next thing that we come to before we actually can get into chapter 1, or part 1, I should say, is how do you divide up the book? Sometimes New Testament books, when you read them, are really easy to follow an outline. Oh, this obviously is point number 1, and this obviously is point number 2. And it's quite easy to go through the book like that. The book of James, not so much. Proverbs has a similar problem. It's short sayings. Sometimes they're lengthy, sometimes they're really short, but they're on a topic. And for us to look at the book of James and try to figure out all the topics it's talking about, it is a bit difficult to do. And there's lots of options and lots of opinions as to how to divide this book into understanding it. I believe it's a series of sermons about trials, faith, worldliness, and the Christian worldview. And so I've divided this into 4 parts. And we're going to take 4 videos to talk about those 4 parts. And so perhaps they're groups of standalone sermons that can be grouped together for a common theme. And so with that being said, if you have your Bibles, why don't you turn to James chapter 1. This first section that I've entitled Trials, it's the test of faith, talking about trials, testing, temptations, all about faith. And so let's go over chapter 1 together. James, a bondservant of Jesus and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greeting. You see that he addresses it to the Jewish people, the 12 tribes, who are scattered throughout because of persecution. And he just has a 1-verse introduction. Greetings. Now he goes into the talk about testings. So obviously, since James brought it up. This is what they were dealing with. They were dealing with being tested and feeling that pressure. And so, in response to that, James is going to tell them there are some difficult things that are actually from God. There's also some evil things that are not from God. But God also gives some good gifts. And that's the way I see breaking down this first section. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect results, so that you will be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So we're told a couple things here. Testing and trials are the same. And we're told the goal and the reason for these trials. So as a believer, Jesus Christ seeing us, we would admit that we're not perfect and that we're lacking, and he knows the same. And to make us more complete, to fill in the things that are lacking within our souls, within our spirits, within our faith, God has allowed some trials and some testings to go on. Now, when I think about trials and testings, I think about those things that are outside of our control. Family situations and circumstances, things that you did not choose, I did not choose, they were thrust upon us. I see those as trials and testings. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is, as it says here, that it would complete something lacking within my faith. There's a growth process in that. And looking back at the trials I had in my high school and college years, I definitely see that God was working in those trials to develop something within me that I have today. Okay, so the first trial that I believe he talks about is of asking things in prayer. But if any of you lacks wisdom, just an example of something that you might lack, but you can ask for, let him ask God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But you must ask in faith, without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wave. For the man ought not to expect that he would receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So here we're told to ask, and to ask for something, whatever that trial that you're in, whatever that request is, to ask without doubting. And the example here is being double-minded. It's like trying to play 2 video games at the same time, or trying to read 2 books at the same time, trying to drive 2 cars at the same time. You cannot be devoted and divided in your mind. And when we ask for something, we are to ask without doubting. To ask and to believe that the Lord hears us and that he will take action in that. So that's one trial he brings up. And the next trial here is the trial of position. Of what position you might hold. Is it high or low? But the brother of humble circumstance ought to glory in his high position, and the rich man who's to glory in his humiliation. Because like flowering grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flowers fall off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too is the rich man in the midst of his pleasures will fade away. In the midst of his pursuits will fade away. Another trial that James brings up is your position in life, whether you are wealthy or not. Regardless of that, he is saying that you are to be humble, that you are to recognize whatever position you hold within a group, within a society. Recognize that God is giving that to you as a way of testing, as a trial to grow and to build your faith. Then he summarizes this with verse 12. It gives us the rewards for these trials and tests that we go through. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trials, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So it's interesting to think about that Jesus takes so careful thought of what you do and your actions that he actually wants to reward you for certain things. So just as I recognize the actions of my children and I want to reward them when they do well, Jesus Christ is watching over us, watching us, and wants to reward us for going through trials in life, going through them, and he rewards us with something called the crown of life. Now, there are a couple crowns mentioned in the New Testament. This one in particular, the crown of life, a reward given to you at the end when we meet Jesus, is this crown of life. And you can search through scriptures, some other New Testament passages that talk about other crowns that are destined for believers that he wants to reward us with. So, testings and trials, difficult things in our lives, actually come from God. Now he makes a break and talks about temptations. I think it's an obvious transition. Trials and testings. Okay, what about temptations? Are those also something that God has brought into our lives to test us? And James is telling the congregation, no. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. Okay, so that clarifies some things. Trials and testings, yes, they are from the Lord, and the Lord has a purpose in that, and the purpose is in that for you to grow in your walk with the Lord. But temptation is not so. But now it gives us the reason in which we're tempted. And see who the blame falls on for temptation. Verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lusts. And when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. So the bad things in our lives, these temptations and those types of things, are not from God. They're actually from ourselves, from our own evil desires, from our lusts, and we pursue that, and then that leads one to another. So the situation of let's say, okay, in my life, my family's, my testimony of my dad's drug addiction, that was a trial and a testing that was thrust upon me that I did not choose. And so God had something for that, and I grew in that difficult trial and testing. But what about the temptation for me to drink? That's not brought on by the Lord. That would be me being curious and saying, oh, I wonder. I saw my dad do this. I think I can do it without getting sucked in. And so it's my own desire there, my own enticement and my own lust that drives me to that temptation. That's not God, that's me. So there's a difference between temptation and trials and testings, and that's what James wants to talk to his congregation about. So the next section, which we're going to end when we get to verse 18, I think he makes a transition here and talks about, what about the good things that God gives us? Are those from God? Verse 16, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father lights, in whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creation. So I think in reference to what has just been said, trials and temptations, difficult things God uses in our lives to grow our faith. Temptations, not from God. The goal of a temptation is for you to fail. The goal of a trial and testing is for you to increase your faith. And sometimes God gives good things and good gifts. And I hope that you can be thinking about some of the good things that God has given you and thank him for that. God's desire is for us to grow as a Christian, and he uses many things in that. And this is to be an encouragement to his congregation that's scattered throughout to increase their faith and to know that God is up to something, whether it's difficult trials and situations or sometimes it's wonderful, good, and perfect gifts that he gives his children. So, hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, why don't you message me somehow and I will try to answer those. Okay, good to see you.